Hello and welcome to the virtual Science Night. My name is Mark and I'm a postdoc at the Cognition and Brain Sciences unit. And myself and my colleagues are interested in youth mental health. And we're working with two big goals. First, we want to figure out the best skills that we can have to manage everyday psychological stressors. And second, we want to figure out the best ways to equip young people with those skills to help promote well-being across the lifespan and avoid things like anxiety and depression. Um, I think a really great way to introduce you to our work is with a bit of a practical example. So, if you're comfortable, I want you to close your eyes for just a moment, or instead, you can just lower your gaze. And then I want you to breathe in for 3 seconds and then out for 4 seconds. And now I want you to try that again. Breathe in for 4 seconds and then out for 5 seconds. And when you're ready, I want you to try and recall an argument that you've had with somebody recently. Something small and something brief, maybe someone in work that you had a slight disagreement with, or it could have been a friend in school. Let the memory that you've picked come back to your mind and hold it vividly. Maybe noticing the situation, remembering what you said. And as you recall all this, you might notice some of the feelings you had of that argument can start come back to you. So maybe you feel a bit of frustration again, or maybe you start to feel some of that anger one more time. And now when you've recalled all this information, I'm going to ask you to do something a little bit strange. In your mind, I want you to imagine taking a few steps away from that situation, as if you're walking the other direction. Take a few mental steps and then stop. And I want you to turn around in your mind. And now you could almost imagine that you can see yourself with that person in that situation. It's almost like you're a fly on the wall of that memory. And once you've taken this perspective, I want you to let that argument play out one more time and just watch it unfold from this distanced perspective. And when you're ready, you can open your eyes. Now, sometimes when we ask people to do that, they'll tell us they found it quite easy. And sometimes people tell us that they find it quite hard. Sometimes people tell us that when they reimagine those experiences from that different point of view, their feelings can change. And maybe it's not as frustrating or as irritating as it was in that moment. And sometimes they can tell us that they have a greater awareness that that argument lives in their memory and that their memory isn't as accurate as the situation was itself. So this might give you a better idea of what we're interested in. We're interested in how people interact and observe everyday difficult experiences in their mind, like difficult thoughts, difficult memories, and difficult feelings. And we have a tendency to look at these things and focus on the content of their experiences. We think about what these experiences are telling us. And as a result, negative feelings and thoughts and memories can start to have a bad impact on our mood and our sense of self. They can make us feel a little bit low. But every now and again, we can almost take a step back from these experiences and notice not just the thoughts we're having, but the act of thinking. Or maybe not just the memories we're having, but the act of remembering. Sometimes we can recall all these experiences with a bigger appreciation for their underlying cognition. And when you see things from this point of view, it might lead you to notice some new information. So maybe if you're noticing your memories, you might notice that maybe your memory is not that accurate. Or if you're noticing your feelings, you might notice that you felt this way before and it's gone away. And then if you're paying attention to your thoughts, you might notice that maybe you have a tendency to beat yourself up and be a little bit hard on yourself. So some people are very good at taking this broader perspective on their everyday psychological experiences, and we call this ability psychological decentering. Now, psychological decentering is something that we've discussed a lot in psychology, and there's been a lot of different things written on it, but no one's really put all the information together into one big place. So, over the last year, my colleagues and I have been going through the literature and trying to figure out what are the main findings around psychological decentering and how can we use that going forward. So, for this talk, I'll just go through some of those facts. Well, the first thing that we've learned is that psychological decentering is an early emerging skill, and it's very useful in helping us regulate negative emotions towards psychological events. And we learned this by inviting people into the lab, like we have in the CBU, and asking them to maybe recall a memory or an unpleasant thought. And then we instruct them on how they can try to take a step back from those experiences, like using the one that we did just there a moment ago. And then we ask them how they feel. And we find that the negative emotions towards these events can start to dissipate a little bit. And we also know that this begins to emerge at the age of around 4 years old. And like I said, some people are really good at this and other people are not so good at it. And what we're learning is that the people who are really good at this skill tend to be a little bit more resilient against anxiety. And also, people who are really good at this skill tend to have lower rates of anxiety and depression. So, when we put all this information together, we were starting to build a bigger idea of how decentering and mental health are related. We know that we all experience psychological stressors like memories and thoughts and feelings that can be a bit unpleasant. And sometimes these can put us at risk of long term symptoms of anxiety and depression. But it's like psychological decentering starts to mitigate that risk by reducing the negative emotional reactivity we have towards those everyday psychological stressors. We also learned that psychological decentering is something that's targeted a lot in treatments for anxiety and depression. So I would say that as long as we've had psychological interventions, there's been references to skills like psychological decentering. So you maybe have heard of mindfulness. Well, mindfulness makes explicit reference to things like decentering and a meta awareness of our cognition. Maybe you've heard of things like acceptance based treatments, and they focus on a skill called cognitive diffusion. Maybe you've heard of cognitive behavioral therapy, and cognitive behavioral therapy makes reference to a skill called self distancing. Or you might have heard of psychoanalysis that makes reference to a decentered self. So we start to see this bigger picture that wherein decentering starts to feature in different psychological interventions. And the evidence seemed to go a little bit deeper. It's not just that these treatments target psychological decentering, but maybe improving psychological decentering could be a key element of the effectiveness of psychological therapy. So, what do I mean by this? Well, boosting decentering may be a key pathway through which interventions improve mental health. So we got information. Some studies have found information by comparing information collected at the beginning of a psychological therapy to information collected at the end of a psychological therapy. So we know we have multiple interventions that can help reduce symptoms. And we find that the positive effect of interventions on symptom reduction is mediated by changes in decentering skills. So perhaps that increase in or psychological decentering is what's driving the change in symptoms across participation in psychological interventions. Other people have tried to explore this by looking at session by session changes in key skills like decentering and clinical outcomes like symptom severity. And so you could imagine this as timeline here as the number of sessions somebody might participate in psychological intervention. And you could imagine this line here being the strength of certain self-reported information. So they might report that their symptoms could be relatively high towards the beginning of psychological therapy, and eventually their symptoms start to go down, and we call this recovery. But these studies also find that if you measure psychological decentering skills across the breadth of sessions, that they begin to peak before symptoms reduce. So this could be telling us that intervention-related changes in symptom severity occur after intervention-related increases in decentering. So perhaps before we can really see great reductions in symptom severity, we first have to see a boost in psychological decentering. Now, all the information was pretty interesting, but there was one thing we found that was quite surprising, giving our focus on youth mental health. So here's like an age timeline from 0 years all the way up to 40 years. This is the average age of a person who took part in a study that had measures of psychological decentering. Here was the minimum age of a person who took part in a study that had measures of psychological decentering. But here's the mean age of onset for anxiety and the mean age of onset for depression. So we know that and depression are, we know that we know that adolescence is a critical period for the development of anxiety and depression symptoms, but they're massively underrepresented in this research line. So we want to investigate this a little bit further. And after we gathered this information, we decided to also invite a couple of youth advisors to discuss decentering as a skill and their feelings and attitudes towards it. And what we found was, well, once we described the idea and introduced some basic techniques, our advisors said that it's sort of an accessible skill that makes sense to them. So one quote was that decentering would be good for people with mental health difficulties. Otherwise, you'd only think about things from your own perspective and you can just get stuck. They also said it was a familiar skill, which is a good thing because it means we're not starting from scratch. They were saying it's helpful if you think of things from your friends' perspectives because you know your friends would want to help you through that. And when you think of things like that, it can calm you down. So we think decentering training could be a really helpful thing for young people and could help us try avoid or push back some of the onset of these experiences of depression and anxiety. So let me tell you a little bit about some of the work we're planning next. The first thing we want to do this year is try to understand whether adolescents naturally use this skill of decentering and how it changes across development. Another thing we want to figure out from that is whether we can teach decentering as a skill so we can boost it and make it better, because we've learned that as your decentering skills go up, your experiences of anxiety and depression can go down. So when we think about these experiences, I think we have some big questions. I think when we're thinking about factors in mental health, we should think about whether it works, when it works, and why it works. Well, we think that decentering has been associated with fewer mental health difficulties. So that answers the question of whether it works. We're learning that it's an emerging skill that begins early in life and that some people are good at using it in day-to-day experiences, but other people have to get better at that skill through participation in psychological therapy. So that tells us a little bit about when it works. And we know that decentering can be useful in dampening our negative responses towards everyday stressors like memories and thoughts and feelings that can be unpleasant. And that tells us a little bit about why it works. So that gives you a quick introduction to our work in youth mental health with our interest in depression. If you wanted to learn more about it, we've written a blog on this. So if you Google National ELF Service or the Mental ELF and put in psychological decentering, you should be able to find this blog here. There's also a podcast where we talk about this for a little bit longer. And we also have some materials on that website, including cartoons and animations and videos. If at any stage you have any other follow-up questions, please feel free to contact me. And thanks for listening.